Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's so wonderful to have you all here joining us. My name is Pamela Lavitt. I'm the Director of Arts and Ideas and Festivals at the Strom Jewish Community Center. And as many of you know, we are running a whole host of virtual programs that have been going on since the mandatory closures, and we will continue to hopefully keep the heartbeat and the pulse and the blood flowing through our community. There are people joining us from near and far today for this amazing program. We are very excited to have a very special guest joining us here today, Ben Katchor. I am going to introduce our special guest, but before I do so, I just wanted to thank the Jewish Book Council, who is our partner in these programs, who brings us many of the authors that we have coming throughout the year. We will be announcing quite a few more authors. I'm very excited that we will be having Jonathan Sarna coming in January for a lecture about his latest book, and the Jewish Women's Archive will be interviewing him, my former employer. I'm very excited. I also just wanted to thank Island Books, who has been our local book selling partner. I very much want to thank them. I also wanted to make mention that if you have not purchased a copy of The Dairy Restaurant, please make sure you do so. You have another 48 hours on our website to make that purchase and support the JCC. And then after that, please go to Island Books. We know that there are local independent booksellers named Amazon here, but they're not independent, and we like to support our folks at Island Books. So it includes shipping, so please purchase with them. I also wanted to make mention that this weekend, I'm very excited that the creator of Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, Rachel Bloom, will be our guest on Saturday night. It is a very special national JCC program that we've put together. There's an amazing New York Times article that was published about her creative process. You can check it out today. And we have Michael Solomonoff, many of you know, and I'm sure that Ben and I will talk a little bit about the current fascination with Israeli cuisine. I know that there's a section of his book about the falafel stand, but I wanted to make mention that it is a free program. Michael Solomonoff will be doing a free cooking class with us. So we will have, all this information is on our website. I will throw the information into the sjcc.org/arts page. I will show that link in a moment. And I wanted to just go ahead and let you know that today's program will run for about 1 hour. I'm thrilled that we have an introduction by a local professor who is going to set us up before we get going. And then, of course, our esteemed guest, Ben Katchor, is here to join us. And he himself has put together a special presentation for everyone as well. So I'd like to go ahead and ask if you would please submit your comments in the Q&A. It just makes it a lot easier for us to let you know that we've answered your questions. We'll try to call you out and thank you for putting them in. We'd like to have a lively conversation about food and memory and, you know, illustrations and picture stories and anything that comes to mind. So please don't hesitate. You can always chat something or throw a link in there, but the Q&A is the best way to submit your questions. Finally, those attendees who are here, we will be recording this and we will share the recording with you. So if for some reason you have to log off, you'll get a recording from us, a private one, in another couple of days. So look for that email from us and we hope to see you at some future events. So I'm going to go ahead and first give you the bios of our esteemed speakers, and then I'm going to welcome Leonard Rifus to join us and begin his brief introduction. I first wanted to introduce him. He is a professor of Seattle Central Community College and the University of Washington, Bothell. He's a scholar of comics, cartooning, manga, and graphic novels, focusing on the 1950s underground comics movement and representations of race, war, and climate change. I've read your Japanese Hiroshima comic, and I have to say that I'm really looking forward to hearing your introduction. But I'm really, really excited, and I feel so honored to have our very special author here today, Guggenheim Fellow and MacArthur Foundation recipient Ben Katchor. Many of you know, or if you didn't, is a Jewish-American cartoonist and illustrator best known for his critically acclaimed comic strip, Julius Knipple, Real Estate Photographer. His comic strip arts is rich in history, sociology, fiction, and poetry, and his fictional work meditates on urban life in New York City, filled with compelling stories and convincingly imagined characters, recalling the 19th and earliest 20th centuries. His picture stories and graphic novels also include The Jew of New York, The Cardboard Valise, Hotel and Farm, Shoehorn Technique, and I love this quote from author Michael Chabon, who of course spends much of his time here in the Bainbridge Island area. He described Katchor as the creator of the last American comic strip. I also just wanted to share with you 2 comments from reviews of this book, which is the topic of today's conversation. The New York Times called The Dairy Restaurant an illustrated love song to Jewish restaurants of old. The Kirkus Review called it an informative, nostalgic evocation of a special urban dining experience. And I have to say, this review went on to talk about the exhaustively researched, entertaining, and profusely illustrated history of Jewish dining preferences and practices. And I am really excited and looking forward to talking with Ben at the end and answering your question about where he found so many rich and credible materials that he writes about. And especially as we have just heard about in the last year and mourned the loss of probably the last Yiddish paper. Obviously the Forwards is no longer going to be doing its print edition. And so these food histories, I feel he's really done us all an incredible service in capturing these colorful anecdotes, trivia, and food lore. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the Zoom, please, my dear friend, Leonard Rifus, who will start his introduction, and then we will continue afterwards with our special author guest, Ben Katchor. Thank you, Leonard. Take it away.
Well, thank you. And get this screen up here. PowerPoint. All right. Okay. Thank you for inviting me to introduce Ben Katchor. I greatly admire his work. I teach at Seattle Central College. I came up through underground comics, and I'm currently correcting the proofs for my first book, Korean War Comic Books, which is about Korean War comic books, and writing and drawing a 5-page comic book story about climate change for an anthology of comics about climate change edited by Joyce Farmer and Sandy Jimenez. Ben Katchor is involved in a variety of things, including musical theater, another combination of words and pictures. And he teaches at is a associate professor of illustration at the New School, Parsons. Until this book, most of his previous books have been compilations of his weekly and monthly comic strips and international republications, translations of those. I encourage you, if you're not already familiar with his comics, to sample them, because it's really easy to do that. He's not somebody who prefers the long form. He prefers the short form, the comic strip form. And so you can read them. I recommend going to archive.org, the Internet Archive, write in his name. 2 of his books are available there to borrow for free as often as you like. The Cardboard Valise and Julius Knippel, Real Estate Photographer. And rather than trying to read the whole thing at once, I recommend reading them the way that they were created, to be read one at a time, because they're dense and rich, and the words and the pictures are very full. He has said that trying to read the whole thing at once would be like trying to race through a book of poetry. And I would say that they're not like poetry, they are poetry. And you can tell that by listening to his TED Talk, Comics of Bygone New York, in which he reads 4 stories that he drew for Metropolis magazine. To sum up what holds together his new book with the comics that he's done, his new book is not comics. They both are centered on an unsentimental appreciation of the remnants of a disappearing working class, lower class, middle class, working class, lower middle class Jewish culture in New York City that has been largely replaced and layered over by a bland, globalized, centralized, relatively homogenized culture. This is a picture of Harvey Kurtzman. Harvey Kurtzman is most famous for being the founding editor of Mad Magazine, but he was also the most important editor of Korean War comic books. And about 35 years ago, I interviewed him, and I started to ask him about Jewish elements in his work. And he cut me off. He said, I didn't want to make it in the Jewish world. I wanted to make it in the big world. And I was startled, because I grew up Jewish in Northern California, and the idea that there could be so many Jews that they would form a whole world was a radically new concept for me. But Ben Katchor was born into that world. There's an anthology of interviews that he's given in which he says, secular cultural Jewishness, that was an enormous world of cultural activity. He was born into that world November 19th at 51, so his birthday is coming right up. Happy birthday. And so he succeeded in compressing into less than 500 pages an introduction to a part of that enormous world of Jewish culture. And I am very excited about his work and eager to hear what he can tell us about it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Leonard, for providing some context for us. And now I welcome Ben to join us. And Leonard, if you'll turn off your, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. I look forward to our conversation in a few moments, but you have, just want to make sure that you can get your video up and we'll begin. Thanks, everyone. Please feel free at any point turn. And I wanted to mention our good friend, David Lasky, Eisner Award-winning Seattle cartoonist, is joining us. So hi, David, just give you a shout out. Take it away.
Hi, thanks. Can you see that, the first slide?
Yep, we're good to go.
Hi. If you mention the word dairy restaurant to someone in New York in 1950 or 60s, they would know exactly what you meant, or at least they would think they knew what you meant. But dairy restaurants, as I discovered, dairy eating places or restaurants that were trying to evoke a pastoral atmosphere are a worldwide phenomenon. And the dairy restaurants I discovered as a young man wandering around New York were this moment in dairy restaurant history. They were, to me, a remnant of largely Eastern European culture. They were a break from meat eating, that you couldn't get meat in them. That made them different than most restaurants I knew. And they were a sort of last moment for working class Jewish culture in New York. The decor, the clientele, they were run by a family or there were small businesses. So those are the kind of restaurants. This is the B&H Dairy luncheonette on 2nd Avenue, a narrow counter with tables along a wall. That was called the Dairy Lunch, and it fit all the definitions of a New York Eastern European dairy restaurant. And then there'd be a place like this. Ratner's was a large restaurant. There was one on Delancey Street, and another part of the family opened one on 2nd Avenue next to the Fillmore East. And this was a cavernous kind of neo-Art Deco interior. I'll see later, you'll see an image of the interior. These restaurants catered to the more than 2 million Jews who immigrated to America in the early part of the 20th century. The dairy restaurant, or the one that I'm talking about, offered an amalgam of regional cuisines that developed in Poland, Russia, Romania, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire over hundreds of years. And these dishes, some were inventions, some were adaptations, but they were all made adapted to comply with Jewish dietary law. That was a piece of the menu. In some cases, maybe 25% of the menu. The rest of the menu were dishes you'd find at any American luncheonette, salads, sandwiches, soups. So one aspect of that Jewish dietary law forbid the mixing of milk and meat and resulted in a cuisine of dishes based upon milk products, vegetables, grains, and fish. Things such as blintzes, cold beet borscht with sour cream, and maybe a boiled potato, knishes, and gefilte fish. For people who no longer followed those dietary laws, the smell and taste of the cuisine had an appeal of its own. That's the interior of the Delancey Street Ratner's. In the process of uncovering the history of these restaurants through archival research and interviews, I came to understand their place in a larger history of institutions devised to feed travelers that goes back to antiquity. The dairy restaurant could only have come into existence when those ancient dietary laws encountered the invention of the restaurant, that unique institution of mid-18th century France. Instead of offering a single dish of the day, the restaurant endeavored to feed people according to their individual biological needs and tastes. Diners could choose what they felt like eating from a large menu of carefully prepared dishes or restaurants. Beyond matters of culinary taste, choosing a restaurant or cafe in early 20th century New York became a social and political act. Restaurants and cafes on the Lower East Side and other parts of the city catered to socialists, anarchists, Orthodox Jews, modernist poets like the Junger. They hung out in a place on East Broadway called Levine and Goodman's. It was a sort of below street level dairy restaurant. And also an American public wanting to experience those exotic subcultures. Now here's a Cymbalon player, Joseph Moskowitz, in a Romanian wine cellar on Houston Street. The question of decor in Jewish restaurants is kind of interesting. Romanians try to evoke the idea of these garden restaurants and Romanian wine cellars in New York. Russian and Polish Jews didn't think of choose an ethnic decor for these dairy restaurants. The dairy restaurants were built around modern luncheonette fixtures, stainless steel and formica counters, and earlier simple bent wooden chairs. They were not thinking about capitalizing on the decor of the country they came from. And that's a very specific Jewish situation. Food choices could be a move toward assimilation or a wholesale rejection of the majority culture. For some, meat eating was associated with the appetitive and aggressive behavior of the upper classes. These are two men eating at Delmonico's, one of the high-end restaurants of New York. Dairy restaurants also catered to a brand of vegetarianism associated with Leo Tolstoy and his Christian anarchist beliefs. That's the spirit of Tolstoy wandering down 2nd Avenue. There were a few restaurants actually named after him. There was even a brand of cigarettes named after him. And the history of vegetarian eating and restaurants sort of crosses paths with Jewish dairies, because dairy restaurants were places conducive to vegetarian eating. A lot of the menu, except for the fish, was acceptable to a vegetarian. My history explores the pastoral impulse, that desire in the face of spreading industrialization and urban life to return to an unspoiled natural environment with its attendant healthful food and curative atmosphere. That's Lenin and his wife took a milk cure, the Swiss Alps, around 1916. There's a whole genre of literature around the milk cure, the kind of sickly or degenerate urban dweller coming to this place and ending up to take a milk cure. That was a regime of just living on milk for a few weeks, and it would theoretically reset your digestive system and cure all kinds of diseases. But these urban visitors would be flirting with the milkmaids and the cow herders. And as I said, there's a whole literature about that. So the pastoral impulse in my book begins in the Garden of Eden, which I describe as a proto-restaurant, a semi-public restaurant that these two people are thrown out of for a certain indiscretion they commit. And it goes on to the public pleasure gardens of 18th century England. There was one specifically catering to Jews, even at that date, to the growth of health resorts and spas throughout Europe. This is Sholem Aleichem in the Marienbad Spa. And he wrote a whole book about that called Marienbad, and it's about wealthy Warsaw Jews coming to this resort for social reasons, not just for the cure, or maybe not at all for the cure. There'd be Hasidim there taking the cure. One thing I discovered there is people who got sick of drinking milk every day for several weeks started to mix it with carbonated water. And I think that may be the real origin of the egg cream, that cutting of milk with seltzer water. Sholem Aleichem had one very famous dairy character, Tevye, the milky one, or people call him the milkman. But a less known dairy figure that Sholem Aleichem wrote about was Yossel Kotek, and he ran a mleczarnia, which was a kind of dairy, means dairy in Polish. It was a kind of dairy cafe. There were many of them in Warsaw in the early part of the 20th century. He was a sort of the quintessential Milichtika personality, a kind of a type that I try to define in the book, someone who is not of this world, living in scheming and thinking, and but not very involved in practical matters of this world. And there's one of the most well-documented dairy restaurants was Friedman's. It was called a Milchhalle, which was the German name for a milk pavilion, and it was in Czernowitz. That's in present-day Romania. And it had all of the makings of a dairy restaurant, the full menu that we associate with that. And the idea of dairy restaurants sort of arose in America in the late 19th century, these establishments called dairy lunchrooms. And they were, some of them were started by milk dealers. There was a big issue about getting fresh milk, and they offered fresh milk and a slice of pie or a sandwich, and later developed into restaurants. And this same hunger, this pastoral impulse, was also a hunger for unspoiled lands. And we can also understand how that led to the European conquest of much of the world and the colonization of these unspoiled countries, parts of the world. And here we have two people, I guess it's a scene toward the end of some echo collapse in this world, and they happen to be Yiddish students, and one is asking the other, are you hungry? The small, desperate restaurateurs who ran those hundreds of now forgotten dairy restaurants chronicled in my book were engaged in the hopeless task of offering the working and middle classes an opportunity to partake of the pastoral impulse within the four walls of a store and the commercial restraints of a brutal market economy. For a contemporary vegan or anyone aware of the ruinous effects of industrialized, animal-based food production, the history of the dairy restaurant may seem to involve quaint and meaningless distinctions. The purpose for compiling this history is to remind us that the city was once composed of countless small businesses offering a wide range of idiosyncratically designed environments in which to eat, while imbibing the political and aesthetic ideologies of your fellow diner, and that the serious business of feeding people was not driven solely by the desire to maximize profit. My book tries to unravel the history of that restaurant culture. So that's the end of my little talk.
Amazing. Thank you
uh,
so much, Ben, for that. Can you see me again?
Yes.
So obviously you spent quite a bit of time sharing with us your illustrations and talking through it, but I have a couple questions first about the dairy restaurant and then just about the form and the content of this actual compilation, which, as I put in the chat, is 498 pages, and clearly, illustrations aside, you've done an incredible amount of work to pull together so much research to make a very rich, almost Talmudic history of commentary about all of this. Let me ask you first, kind of, why did the dairy restaurants disappear? It makes me think about, people say, I sang in a Yiddish chorus in New York for many years, and nobody believes that there were about 40 of them in the 1930s. How many dairy restaurants have you figured out existed, worldwide or in New York, and why did they actually disappear?
Well, yeah, the ones listed or cataloged in my book are about 250 between 1898 and the 80s or 90s when I stopped. The thing is, they haven't disappeared. They've been transformed into kosher pizzerias and modern upscale kosher seafood restaurants that are on the dairy side of the menu. And there was the kind of source population for this, the Eastern European food, was largely murdered during the Second World War. So that puts a big dent into a continuing cultural artifact like food. The other thing that happened is second and third generation Jews assimilated and got a taste of world cuisine. And, how can a plate of noodles and pot cheese stand up to all of the cuisines of the world? And, this was also, there was a big, I remember when I was a child, people were very worried about eating Eastern European Jewish food because it was very heavy and high in fat. Before statins, before you could take anything to adjust your, I think Zero Mostel has a joke that more Jews were killed in delicatessens than during the Second World War. And I mean, statistically, it's probably true. But it was not a particularly healthy diet to live on all the time. And the other thing is that the working class restaurateur did not want their children to go into the restaurant business because it was a really hard work and low profit margin, and most of the children didn't take over these restaurants, so that didn't help either. And I think, but unless there is a kind of renewing source of taste for a certain kind of food, a taste can die out, just like a taste in art or a taste in literature can just end. So that's somewhat what happened. You can eat all of the varieties, all of the styles of food that are still eaten in Poland and the Ukraine and Russia. Those still go on. They may not have that, the Jewish inflection, you know, how they adapted those dishes. But I mean, if I want a blintz for dinner and I'm downtown, I go to a Polish restaurant. There is no, I mean, there's hardly the B&H, I think, is the last one on Second Avenue they have a part of that Eastern European menu. The last time I went in there, I asked them if they still had served gefilte fish, and the counterman said, we haven't served gefilte fish here for 25 years. So
Yeah.
so that's what happened to
So I think
that particular kind of dairy restaurant. As I said, there are thousands of kosher pizzerias and falafel stands that stay on the dairy side of the ledger. But
well, I think when I was living in the Lower East Side, Ratner's closed and around the corner, and they opened up a speakeasy for 20-something-year-olds to head upstairs. But I'm curious to know if you think, I know there's some comments here that folks from Toronto say that not all of these are gone. There's a couple that's still in Toronto and some other places. I guess United Bakers has been around for 100 years. But I'm curious what you think the loss or the creation of the dairy restaurant says about Jewish culture. Obviously, we think about Ashkenazic culture as the I don't do dairy culture. So you're arguing something very different about the meaning of dairy in Jewish culture. What are you saying about the Milchadic world?
Oh, it was a break. Once industrialized meat made it readily available, people who could afford it basically ate meat all the time. And maybe once a week, you'd say, okay, we're going to have milchdichs tonight. And it was a break from meat eating, at least among the Jews I grew up with. It wasn't the norm, unless you were a vegetarian. But it's a part of Ashkenazic cuisine. Although the man who opened what I mention as the first dairy restaurant in New York, a guy named Jacob Campos, was a Sephardic Jew from Bucharest. He was a palanchinka, a baker of those flat, round pastries in Romania. And when he came to New York, I think he realized the market was in blintzes and in more Russian and Polish oriented food, and he became known as the famous blintz maker. Mm. So, it's, I think this has to do with those populations shifted, the restaurants either went out of business or moved, mm-hmm. The movement of the Jewish immigrant population from the Lower East Side up to Harlem, up to the Bronx, out to Brooklyn. The restaurants followed them.
So I want to ask a little bit about your research for the book. And if it's okay in a minute, I'm going to share a couple of the pages that I bookmarked after reading it. There are so many illustrations, not only from you, but from newspapers, ephemera, menus, depictions of proprietors. I don't know if those were from photographs or from advertisements. One of my favorite images is, the Center Dairy Restaurant in the Garment District, with people whooshing by. This is your illustration, right, with clothing. But I wanted to ask a little bit about the memorialization of this happened through so much research. You did a ton of research. I mean, everyone from Tolstoy to Voltaire to Trotsky, you have such characters that are appearing in the book as well, and their relationship. And the milk cure reminded me also like the Ziegfeld Follies. Some of the Ziegfeld Follies girls took milk baths. And I think now that I realize it was probably an indication that they were Polish Jews and that this was the milk spa that you talked about in the cure. and they were teasing their insider Yiddish theater friends. But could you tell me a little bit about some of your incredible methodical research, and what's the story of the creation of this book? It's such a departure.
I was interested in Yiddish culture in New York. My father was a Yiddish speaker from Warsaw, and in the 80s, I think, I started looking up people who were in the restaurant business. I thought that was an interesting entree because, Jewish culture is made up of many things. Religion is part of it, food is part of it. What else is part? Literature, say music. I mean, there are all these aspects of it, and not everyone is involved in every aspect. Food was something that really interested me, along with music and other things. But I looked up some of these people who were still around then, like the Geffens, who ran a restaurant in a dairy in the Garment District, and I just called them up and I said, could I talk to you about that? So I got some interviews back, I guess it was maybe the late 80s or early 90s. So I've been collecting this material for many years. So it wasn't a methodical research project. It was pieced together with a lot of looking around and looking through Yiddish newspapers. It's not a very well documented kind of restaurant, because there are very few postcards from dairy restaurants. There are many more from meat restaurants. They were not places you'd go to, brag about. They were kind of the place to get away from the competitive world.
Mm.
So even when people would write about slumming on the Lower East Side, it was usually in a Romanian restaurant, not in a dairy restaurant. So I think my approach was to write about everything around these dairy restaurants, and by the absence in that sort of missing hole, you would get a sense of what these were. These were not like this.
Mm-hmm.
By negating what they by saying what they were not like, helped define it, I think, for this book.
Hmm.
And that whole idea of that I sort of invented the Milchdika personality, the dairy personality.
Could you tell us a little bit about that? I read an interview, but can you describe how you come up with a milk personality and a meat personality?
Well, yeah, that's goes back to the ancient world, this whole theory of you are what you eat. And it comes up in probably every culture. Appetitive people were meat eaters, the English beefsteak eater, and people who didn't eat enough meat or lived mainly on vegetables or milk products were more mild-mannered. And not only mild-mannered, but maybe not that much of this world. They'd become involved in intellectual pursuits and things maybe that would never be realized in the physical world. And I spend a long section of the book trying to explain what that is.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a Yiddish expression, bleibt with the milche bank. He remains on the dairy bench. He
Right.
didn't take part in he just didn't really get involved in the world. And
Well, I love all the Yiddish expressions, even the one which I won't say it in Yiddish, even though I probably should. But it was about, that you can milk a cow, but, to eat meat, you have to kill it. And there is an interesting part of your book, which is about this sort of various associations with vegetarianism. I think you said Voltaire and the Edenistics, kind of like looked at vegetarianism early on through the Garden of Eden and this feminization at times versus meat eating, you know, strength. And then there's a section about radical politics and the milk cure and utopian agrarianism. I guess what I'm saying is that you take us on this incredibly rich, to use a milk metaphor, sort of creme brulee tour de force of the paroxysms of Jewish identity over many years, right? The Edenic diets, you know, the ethical rulings, the kashrut. So it's interesting that milk becomes this window into the sacred profane, the Jew versus country, the questions of citizenship and whether you can eat at the same table. It brings up just so many rich, different ideas throughout history. So how does this through line of milk, and how did you find some of these stories to tell, you know, the Trotsky, you know, anecdotes, other things like this. And then the Sholem Aleichem thing, I'd like to talk about a little bit more before we get to questions. I have a few things I want to talk about with Sholem Aleichem.
I just looked a lot, and you know, the thing is, if you look at the world through any particular lens, if you're only interested in eyeglasses, you'll see the world in one way. So for, you know, 20 or 30 years, I was looking at everything I read through this lens of dairy eating, and then this stuff pops up. I mean, people I meet tell me they've read the Menachem Mendel stories by Sholem Aleichem, but never, it just passed by them as a irrelevant detail that this character that appears, the Yussel Kotek, had a dairy cafe. It was not something they were looking for. And I think a lot of what I discovered was very plain to be seen, but you had to want to look at it through that lens. I mean, it's not like deep, some of it is deeply hidden in old directories and old phone books, but I mean, that's what every researcher does. You look at this stuff. But I think the more interesting discoveries were there in plain sight. They were not, people were not reading Jewish culinary history with that in mind. So,
well, I mean, I even
given
think
very short shrift in most, even, you know, books about Jewish restaurant culture. So
well, it's interesting, Fiddler on the Roof, you spend quite a bit of time a little bit talking about Tevye, and obviously people who haven't maybe read the original or don't know the Kasrilivka stories or other things like that in Yiddish. But, you know, the Tzeitel, of course, is supposed to marry the butcher, right? And, you know, milk and meat don't mix, right? And so even there's a level of the most common, you know, representation of Jews on Broadway, the significance of some of Sholem Aleichem's commentary, putting the sacred and the profane next to each other, don't always come through. I think you spent a lot of time, actually. I mean, Sholem Ash appears in your book, a lot of Yiddish writers. But what's interesting is at the kernel of this, you talk about the vexing laws of kashrut are really not Talmudic, right? They're just vexing laws, right? Chuchim, right?
Yeah, not to be understood. Well, according to some Jews, they're not to be, I don't think we should generalize about anything to do with a nation as, you know, broad and all-encompassing. But, you know, yeah, to some Jews, they say these are not things meant to be understood by the human mind. And other Jews want to come up with reasons why these laws were happened. And it's all fascinating. And it's all part of that history. So I had to get pretty deeply involved in reading about it. And there's a really large literature about that in all through anthropological studies, you know, not wanting to drink what blood meant to different groups of people and all of that. So anyway, I had to, and that's, I think, you could say, I wouldn't say I'm a culinary Jew, which is kind of usually a way people insult people whose only interest in Jewish culture is food. I would say I'm a historical Jew. I'm interested in the history of Jews.
Yes.
But I don't live in any of those. I live in this historical moment. I don't want to particularly live in
Well,
another
I believe
period.
your
But,
book, you're definitely, you can call yourself, food historians have puzzled very much over the creation of Jewish dishes in general. I think your book makes a great attempt at talking about sort of the history and the sort of waves of vegetarianism and the positives and negatives of it and how the dairy lunchrooms. I do think that your book really illustrates two things, and then I want to just ask a question about illustration, and then we're going to go to questions. Is the transformative power of food, right? The pick and choose notion of Judaism, if you want to call it that, what's on your plate. But you had to, through your actual picture illustrations, depict something that in many ways there were no images of. So can you just talk a little bit about, besides the food history, how you and why you 498 pages are filled with images of the proprietors of restaurants, of people
right.
eating together, of children, of dogs. I mean, there's the Garden of Eden. What was that? What was that process? Do you have a favorite image or something that came to mind that you thought, this doesn't exist, I need to make sure that it
Oh,
has a
yeah.
mental space for the humans to see?
Yeah, I don't think it's not a very well documented history. And where photographs do exist, I wanted to kind of interpret them with my handwriting as I saw them. And just
Mhm.
putting up a photograph doesn't really inhabit the photograph I wanted to understand them. So rethinking them, more like the way an archaeologist would reconstruct something from little bits and pieces. I could look at images, there are the few images there are of interiors of a certain kind of working class cafe. And I could piece things together, kinds of chairs and kinds of furniture and clothing, and then reconstruct the interior of a dairy restaurant. There's no photo of, like, there's one of, I think it's in my slideshow, the one where there's a piece of strip of fly paper hanging
Mm.
off the ceiling. That's there's no image of that restaurant. And the daughter of the owner described it to me in great detail, and I kind of reconstructed it.
Yes.
So these things had to be reconstructed. And even if a photo did exist, I wanted to filter it through my understanding of the photograph. So
Well, I think you managed to very successfully start with the Garden of Eden and then create a kind of lost paradise throughout the book of the dairy restaurant. And I'm going to get to some questions that people have, and because quite a few comments. And yes, I just want to thank Rabbi Morel, who talked about, and in your book, you talk quite a bit about the boiling a kid or seething a kid in the milk of its mother. And that's the one verse in the Torah. So I'm going to go ahead and ask, you have a big fan here in Stephen Bergson, if I pronounced your name right. So he says he's really wants to know the inside scoop here. And I know something about Tablet Magazine and your relationship to this book. Maybe you can illuminate, but can you talk about the delays, the long process between conception and publication of the dairy restaurant? I know it was supposed to be with a different publisher originally. I think you are in Schocken. I think Schocken is the publisher.
yeah, no, it was always Next Book Shocking. It's a partnership. No, it's just that I went through several editors because they retired or left the publishing company, but they were very patient, and they knew most of the books in this series are kind of extended essays. They're not involved in doing a lot of original research. So they knew it would take time, and they were very patient. So it's not a topical book. I mean, there are some, it's a book of history.
Mm. Rabbi Morel asks, can you discuss I.B. Singer and his life as a vegetarian? I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
he became, it was a big thing when he became a celebrity in the English-speaking world. He had already become a confirmed vegetarian, but that was not until he was 65 years old. He said it always bothered him, but he ate meat. It was a kind of late in life conversion to vegetarianism. And yeah, there's quite a few anecdotes about him. He liked lived on the Upper West Side, so he went to the famous dairy on 72nd Street, and he worked when he was at the Forwards. He ate at the Garden Dairy Cafeteria on East Broadway, up the street from the Forwards building. But you know, there are a couple of anecdotes in the book. You know, some people consider Jewish dietary law a form of a modified vegetarianism. In other words, you can pick an apple off a tree. Anybody can pick an apple off a tree, see if there are no worms in it, and eat it. But if you want to eat a piece of meat and kill an animal, it becomes a very involved process to sort of, you could say that is deterring people from eating meat. It's not as easy to do it. So.
The number of jokes about people who've gone to heaven and asked for the salad plate because it's not kosher enough. Ellen Krett asks, is B&H still in operation? Didn't non-Jewish immigrants take it over at some point?
Yeah, it's still in business. It survived so far the pandemic. As I said, they don't make gefilte fish anymore, but they still make, they had Ukrainian, you know, in the days when I first went there in the 80s, they had Ukrainian and Polish women in the kitchen. And it was a dairy. It never was had a certification, as anybody watching how strictly kosher, how strictly dairy it was, but it was a dairy restaurant. And yeah, it's one of the last in Manhattan. Called a Dairy Lunch. So it definitely picked up that name from the American
I love your illustration
institution.
of all the kashrut logos in the book too. I think it goes on for a couple of
Yeah,
pages.
there's some guy going around now offering certification for vegetarian restaurants, and I don't think other mashgiachs take him too seriously, but you know, who's to say? He puts his name on this document. So they have one of those now, I think.
Amazing. One of my favorite short films.
They never did. But anyway, what was that? Sorry.
One of my favorite short films is 888 Go Kosher. Go Google it, people. I'll see if I can put a link. It's a fabulous, funny story of how you kosher your kitchen. Arlen Schumer asks, how do you classify Sammy's Romanian on Christie Street? Are they still there? They serve steaks and egg creams.
Right. I think they're still there. At least the last I was. Well, that's called Jewish style restaurant, and these things started to arise in the 50s down in Miami Beach and also in New York, and they would have milk and meat on the same menu, and by many customers eaten at the same meal, so they were not observing Jewish dietary law. And that's what Sammy's. It's a Romanian steakhouse, and you know, who would want an egg cream after eating a steak? I don't know, but they serve it. So you know, that's kind of the mythology of Jewish food. It should all be there. It should all be available, not just the dairy part.
Yeah, my friends in Toronto, Yid Life Crisis, have also done a number of really fun I think Chudeism, Chew, Chudeism has obviously also explored some of the old Toronto, food culture. And Arlen actually asked, put in some comments. We're now getting to comments. Veselka makes great triangle blend, says yes, Veselka. The Ukrainian places on the Lower East Side also
Yeah.
kind of, what's this relationship between them? They've somehow survived.
They were kind of a luncheonette. I don't know if they maybe, well, these are young Ukrainian and Polish people who still want to be in the restaurant business. There was a generation of Jews who were, moved into the professions, and so the idea of running a restaurant, other than a big corporate kind of scale restaurant, was not in the cards. So yeah, there's always, it's the perfect job for a first generation immigrant who doesn't want to work for somebody else. Somebody knows how to cook, and you can open a restaurant. Whether you're willing to do all the work yourself, then it's an enormous amount of labor. So yeah, there's only a few Polish and Ukrainian restaurants left down there. So even those are disappearing. And that has to do with rents and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
But there's still young people coming from Poland and the Ukraine who need a job, and they have waiters, and there are very few, young Jewish immigrants coming from
Well, we
Eastern
have
Europe.
a couple more
So, yeah,
comments.
there's still a source of people
Yeah.
to run these restaurants.
So Carol Goldberg shared that she grew up in New Jersey, and we would have dairy for one dinner during the week and Chinese for another and meat or chicken for all the rest. So you mentioned that
Yeah.
it became sort of a special night. Leonard asked a question. He said, the drawing of the B&H looks like a sketch you made from life, but so do the drawings going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. How much visual invention did you have to fill in the story where source materials were scarce? And I know you partially explained that, but how much was drawn from your life experience?
Some of these are absolutely from memory, not the B&H, because I can go there. I mean, that's accessible. I have photos I looked at. The ones that are gone are literally memory reconstructions, and some of them are identified as such, some are not. But no, it's again just like people trying to put together the cities of ancient Sumeria. You can do it if you have a few details, and so that's how I did it. And the idea is to make a drawing have enough observational detail, or the illusion of observational detail, so that it feels believable. So
So maybe lastly, we can end on a contemporary note. There are a couple of things. Well, I think here's a fun throwaway. If we had a speed round and we had time, Ellen asked a great question. So what is your favorite dairy dish?
I would say something I would tend not to make myself, like a filter fish, because it's a kind of an involved dish. Yeah, that if I could walk back in time to the famous dairy on 72nd Street, I'd have like a filter fish with a side of kasha vanishkas, and I guess maybe creamed spinach and horseradish on the side. Yeah, I guess but I like all of these dishes. I mean, I make my own kasha knishes, and I have a big bowl of cold borscht in my refrigerator, even though it's becoming cold outside.
I love at
So
the
I
end of
make
the
this
book.
food. Yeah.
Love at the end of the book that you do sort of write a book slightly in reverse. I think Leonard pointed out there's no index, there's no table of contents, but you have probably about at least 75, maybe more pages where you really are memorializing some of the menus, the lists of what was on the menu, the slight description, and then there are some rich stories that are illustrated. I just wanted to put that out there because I want people to know that this is a book that you're going to enjoy for Shavuot. Obviously, when you're ready to talk about why dairy is part of Jewish culture and you're like, I don't remember why it is, but we make cheesecake. I think this book will help you along the way for some amazing conversation. I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time. I want to thank everybody who's joined us. I know there were a couple of more comments here, but we try to keep it to an hour and it's late where you are, Ben. This is an amazing conversation. I really appreciate your time and effort to be here. My last question to you is, do you have anything to say about the current and contemporary world of Jewish cuisine, and maybe that is something that you want to comment on or don't want to comment on with the upsurge of Israeli cooking and how, if there's a trajectory there or not?
Yeah, the thing I miss is not so much the food, but the aesthetic of a working class Jewish culture. And it could be I love working class Dominican restaurants and Chinese restaurants. So that there aren't, except in Hasidic neighborhoods, there are still kind of very utilitarian places geared to working people. Yeah, that's what I miss, that you know, the Jewish world that I grew up in pushed everyone to leave the working class for you know, for economic reasons, but the aesthetics were lost somewhere. Something got lost, and so you know, if you have a complaint about the way the world is running now, you know, that it's the high level of financialization and the, what do you call it, things built-in obsolescence, all of that stuff is something that would not be part of a culture with less sort of flamboyant affluence. So yeah, that's what I miss about those places. The food, I can make a semblance of the food, and you know, and that goes for, you know, whatever the cuisine is. And it happens, yeah, it just happens that the generation after most of these restaurants went into, sort of left that aesthetic behind. But it's one of the downsides of affluence, I think.
You've managed to create, as you do in many of your work, just a rich intellectual history for us to plumb. And with the loss of delis, I imagine you have another book coming somewhere down the road. But
no, there is a book just came out about delis. I haven't read it though, but it just
I want to thank you so much for your book and for your time. I want to thank everyone for joining us. And during COVID, people seem to be making a lot more babkas and kasha varnishkis and the old foods that make us happy. So if you'd like to still purchase a copy of the book, please go to our website for the next 48 hours or support Island Books, and please support Ben Katchor and all that he does. Thank you so much, Ben. And do you have another project, by the way, that you can let us know what's on the horizon?
I'm working on a collection of strips called Hotel and Farm. It's 1 week it's about hotel culture, the next week it's about agriculture. It alternates, and there's a big framing story. That's what I'm working on now.
Amazing.
So back to comics, right?
Thank you all, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Ben Katchor. It's been an honor. Thank you, Leonard Rifus, for doing your introduction. Thank you all.
Thank you, Leonard.
Be safe and take care. Be well. And eat lots of dairy. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.